The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Willow Creek, a frontier town that had sprung up alongside the railroad tracks like wildflowers after a prairie rain. It was the autumn of 1883, and the leaves on the few cottonwood trees that lined Main Street were turning the color of burnished copper, a fitting backdrop for a town built on dreams of gold and the promise of new beginnings. Among the weathered storefronts and hastily constructed buildings stood a modest schoolhouse, its white paint peeling from years of harsh prairie winds and unforgiving sun. Inside, Miss Margaret Holloway prepared for another day of teaching the children of Willow Creek, her heart heavy with a burden she carried in silence. Margaret was 34 years old, an age that marked her as a confirmed spinster in the eyes of most folks in 1883. She had arrived in Willow Creek 3 years earlier, answering a desperate advertisement placed by the town council for a schoolteacher. The previous teacher, a young man fresh from college back east, had lasted exactly 6 weeks before fleeing back to civilization, claiming that teaching frontier children was impossible and that the isolation would drive any sensible person mad. Margaret had proven him wrong on both counts, transforming the chaotic one-room schoolhouse into a place of learning and discipline. But the isolation remained her constant companion. What the townspeople didn't know, what Margaret shared with no living soul, was the deep well of sorrow that colored every aspect of her existence. Years ago, in her hometown of Philadelphia, a doctor had delivered news that shattered her world with clinical precision. She would never bear children of her own. The medical terms were foreign and harsh, but their meaning was devastatingly clear. Her dreams of motherhood, of holding her own baby and watching a child grow under her guidance, would forever remain just that, dreams. The diagnosis had ended her engagement to Robert Sinclair, a kind man who had gently explained that he needed a wife who could give him sons to carry on his family name. Margaret had understood his position, even as it broke her heart. The journey to Willow Creek had been Margaret's escape from the pitying looks and well-meaning advice of family and friends who couldn't understand why she didn't simply accept her fate and find contentment in being an aunt to her sister's children. But every family gathering had become a reminder of what she would never have. Every baby in her sister's arms, a knife twist in an already wounded heart. Teaching had always been her passion, and the frontier offered the possibility of starting over, of finding purpose in educating other people's children since she could never have her own. Margaret threw herself into her work with a dedication that bordered on obsession. She arrived at the schoolhouse before dawn each morning, lighting the wood stove and preparing lessons by lamplight. She stayed long after her students had gone home, grading papers and planning activities that would challenge and inspire young minds. The children of Willow Creek came from diverse backgrounds, the sons and daughters of railroad workers, merchants, farmers, and prospectors who had followed their dreams westward. Some came to school clean and well-fed, while others arrived hungry and wearing clothes that had seen too many seasons without replacement. Margaret treated each child with the same care and attention, but she was especially drawn to the ones who seemed lost or forgotten. There was Timothy Morrison, whose father drank too much and whose mother had died the previous winter, leaving him to care for his 3 younger siblings. Sarah Beth Coleman, whose family lived in a soddy outside town and who walked 3 miles each way to attend school, often arriving with frost on her eyebrows in winter. The Kowalski twins, recent immigrants from Poland, whose parents spoke no English and who struggled to help their children with their studies. These children became the focus of Margaret's maternal instincts, and she found herself bringing extra food to school, mending torn clothing during lunch breaks, and staying after hours to provide additional instruction to those who needed it. She created a lending library from her own books, organized spelling competitions that came with small prizes purchased from her own meager salary, and established a tradition of Christmas celebrations that included gifts for every child, regardless of their family's financial situation. But despite the satisfaction she found in teaching, Margaret's cottage behind the schoolhouse remained painfully quiet in the evenings. She would sit by her window with a cup of tea, watching the lights come on in the houses throughout town, imagining the families gathering for dinner and children being tucked into bed with bedtime stories. The ache of loneliness had become her constant companion, a dull pain that she had learned to carry with the same stoic determination that frontier life demanded. Margaret had received several marriage proposals during her time in Willow Creek, from decent men who saw her as a practical choice for a wife. There was William Fletcher, the bank president, who was recently widowed and needed someone to help raise his 3 daughters. Henry Morrison, Timothy's father, had approached her one evening with a slurred proposal, suggesting that they could help each other with their respective burdens. Even the town doctor, a confirmed bachelor in his 50s, had hinted that a marriage of convenience might benefit them both. But Margaret couldn't bring herself to accept any of these offers. They didn't love her, and she didn't love them. More importantly, she couldn't bear the thought of entering a marriage under false pretenses, knowing that she could never give her husband the children he would inevitably want. The autumn of 1883 had been particularly challenging for Willow Creek. An early blizzard had destroyed the late harvest, leaving many families struggling to put food on their tables. The railroad company had laid off workers, and several businesses had closed their doors permanently. Margaret noticed the effects immediately in her classroom, as more children arrived at school hungry and some stopped coming altogether, needed at home to help their families survive. She began using more of her own money to provide meals and supplies, stretching her already tight budget to its breaking point. It was during this difficult time that everything changed. On the bitter November morning, when the first heavy snow of the season had blanketed Willow Creek in pristine white, Margaret arrived at the schoolhouse to find something that would alter the course of her life forever. As she approached the building, keys in hand and breath forming clouds in the frigid air, she noticed that the door was slightly ajar. Her first thought was that she had forgotten to lock it properly the evening before, but as she pushed it open and stepped inside, she realized she was not alone. Huddled in the far corner of the classroom, wrapped in what appeared to be a horse blanket, was a small figure that made Margaret's heart skip a beat. It was a child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 or 7 years old, with tangled dark hair and enormous brown eyes that held far too much fear for someone so young. The child was awake but motionless, watching Margaret with the alertness of a wild animal ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Margaret's teacher instincts took over immediately. Moving slowly and speaking in the gentle tone she used with her most frightened students, she approached the child with careful deliberation. "Hello, sweetheart," she said softly, removing her own warm cloak and holding it out as an offering. "My name is Miss Holloway. Are you cold? Are you hurt?" The child's eyes tracked Margaret's every movement, but she remained silent, clutching the horse blanket around her small frame like a shield. Margaret could see that the child was in desperate condition. Her clothes were little more than rags, torn and filthy from what must have been days or weeks of hardship. Her face was gaunt with hunger, her lips cracked from cold and dehydration. Most troubling of all were the bruises that mottled her arms, and what Margaret could see of her legs, bruises in various stages of healing that suggested a pattern of abuse rather than accidental injury. The sight filled Margaret with a protective rage unlike anything she had ever experienced. Without hesitation, Margaret lit the wood stove and began preparing a simple breakfast from the supplies she kept at school for students who arrived hungry. She moved deliberately, narrating her actions in a soothing voice so the child would know what to expect. "I'm lighting the fire to warm us up," she explained, "and I'm making some oatmeal and tea." "When was the last time you had something to eat?" The child's eyes followed the food preparation with an intensity that broke Margaret's heart, but she still didn't speak. As the classroom warmed and the smell of food filled the air, Margaret tried different approaches to communicate with the mysterious child. She asked about her name, her family, where she had come from, whether she was hurt, but received no response beyond those watchful brown eyes. It wasn't until Margaret placed a bowl of warm oatmeal and a cup of sweetened tea within the child's reach that she finally moved, falling upon the food with a desperation that spoke of prolonged hunger. Margaret watched with growing concern as the child devoured the simple meal. The way she ate suggested she hadn't had adequate food in quite some time, and the fearful glances she kept casting toward the door indicated she expected to be driven away at any moment. When the other students began arriving for the day's lessons, Margaret faced an immediate dilemma. She couldn't leave the child alone, but she also had responsibilities to her regular students. She made a quick decision that would prove to be life-changing. "Children," Margaret announced to her arriving students, "we have a special visitor today. This little girl needs our help, and I know I can count on all of you to show her the kindness and compassion that make me proud to be your teacher." The children of Willow Creek had learned well from Margaret's example, and they accepted the mysterious newcomer with the easy generosity of youth. Timothy Morrison immediately offered to share his lunch, while Sarah Beth Coleman brought a clean handkerchief to help clean the child's face. Throughout the morning lessons, Margaret kept one eye on her regular students and another on the silent child who had taken refuge in the corner. She noticed that despite her obvious trauma, the girl was clearly intelligent. Her eyes followed the lessons with keen interest, and Margaret caught her lips moving silently as the children recited their multiplication tables. When Margaret wrote letters on the blackboard, the child traced them in the dust on the floor beside her makeshift bed. During the lunch break, while the other children played outside in the snow, Margaret sat beside the mysterious girl with 2 plates of food. "I can see that you're very smart," she said gently, "and I can see that someone has hurt you badly, but you're safe here now. Whatever happened before, whatever brought you to my schoolhouse, you don't have to face it alone anymore." For the first time, the child's stoic facade cracked slightly, and Margaret saw tears gathering in those enormous brown eyes. It was then that Margaret noticed the rope burns around the child's wrists, partially hidden by the oversized sleeves of her tattered dress. The marks were old, but clearly visible, suggesting that this poor child had been restrained, possibly for extended periods. The discovery filled Margaret with a cold fury and an equally strong determination to protect this helpless little soul from whoever had inflicted such cruelty upon her. As the days passed, a routine developed that felt as natural as breathing. The child, whom Margaret had privately begun calling Hope, would be waiting in the schoolhouse each morning when Margaret arrived. She never saw where Hope went at night, but she left food and blankets at the school each evening, and they were always gone by morning. Hope remained silent, but she began participating in the lessons in small ways, following along with reading exercises and solving arithmetic problems in the dust beside her corner. Margaret's other students embraced Hope with remarkable kindness, sharing their lunches and including her in their games during recess, even though she rarely participated actively. The children seemed to sense that Hope needed gentleness and patience, and they provided both without being asked. Margaret was proud of her students' compassion, but she was also deeply worried about Hope's situation. Winter was coming in earnest, and she couldn't bear the thought of this child facing the brutal prairie cold without adequate shelter. Margaret began making discreet inquiries around town, asking if anyone knew of a missing child or a family that might be looking for a little girl. But Willow Creek was a transient place, with people coming and going regularly, and no one had any information about Hope's identity or origins. The nearest law enforcement was 2 days' ride away, and communication with other towns was limited by the weather and the primitive transportation available. As November turned to December, Margaret found herself thinking about Hope constantly. The child had become the center of her world, the first thing she thought about when she woke, and the last thing on her mind before sleep. For the first time since her devastating diagnosis years earlier, Margaret felt truly needed, not just as a teacher, but as a protector and caregiver. The maternal instincts she had tried so hard to suppress came flooding back with an intensity that sometimes left her breathless. Hope was clearly thriving under Margaret's care, gaining weight and colour as regular meals and warmth did their healing work. But more importantly, she was beginning to trust. She no longer flinched when Margaret approached, and she had started following Margaret around the schoolhouse during breaks, a silent shadow who seemed to find comfort in proximity. Margaret began leaving books and slates out specifically for Hope, watching with wonder as the child taught herself to write letters and numbers with remarkable skill. The breakthrough came on a snowy December afternoon that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. She was staying late to prepare Christmas decorations for the schoolhouse, wanting to create a special celebration for her students during what she knew was a difficult time for many families. Hope was in her usual corner, but instead of watching silently, she had picked up a piece of chalk and was writing something on her slate with great concentration. Margaret approached slowly, not wanting to startle the child, and looked over her shoulder at what she had written. In careful, perfectly formed letters, Hope had written a single word: Mama. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she read it, understanding immediately what the child was trying to communicate. Hope looked up at her with those enormous brown eyes, eyes that now held hope instead of just fear, and spoke her first words since arriving at the schoolhouse. "Are you my mama now?" Hope whispered, her voice small and uncertain, but filled with desperate longing. The question hung in the air between them, simple in its wording but profound in its implications. Margaret felt her heart stop for a moment as she looked down at this brave little girl who had endured so much but still had the courage to reach for love. In that moment, all of Margaret's pain about her infertility, all her longing for motherhood, and all her dreams of having a family crystallized into perfect clarity. The universe had brought this child to her, not in the way she had always imagined, but in exactly the way they both needed. Margaret knelt down to Hope's level, taking the child's small hands in her own. "Oh, my darling girl," Margaret whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, if you want me to be, I will be your mama, forever and always." Hope's response was immediate and heartbreaking. She threw her arms around Margaret's neck with a fierceness that spoke of years of longing for exactly this kind of love and acceptance. "I've been waiting for you," Hope whispered against Margaret's shoulder. "I knew if I was very good and very quiet, my real mama would find me." The words broke Margaret's heart and mended it simultaneously, as she realized that this child had been searching for her just as desperately as she had been searching for a child to love. As they held each other in the quiet schoolhouse, with snow falling outside and lamplight casting a warm glow around them, Margaret felt a peace she had never experienced before. The woman who had been told she would never be a mother was being chosen as a mother by a child who needed her desperately. It was as if every painful step of her journey had been leading to this moment, to this child, to this perfect completion of both their lives. The practical arrangements that followed were challenging but not impossible. Margaret had to navigate territorial laws regarding orphaned children, but she had powerful allies in the Willow Creek community who had witnessed the transformation in both Margaret and Hope. The town doctor, who had initially been one of Margaret's suitors, became her strongest advocate, testifying to Hope's obvious improvement under Margaret's care, and arguing that separating them would be harmful to the child's well-being. The process was complicated by Hope's inability or unwillingness to provide information about her past. She never spoke about where she had come from or who had hurt her, maintaining a silence that Margaret respected rather than trying to force. It became clear that Hope had suffered severe trauma, but also that she felt safe for the first time in her young life and was beginning to heal under Margaret's loving care. Margaret formally adopted Hope in the spring of 1884 in a ceremony held in the very schoolhouse where they had found each other. The entire town turned out for the occasion, and there wasn't a dry eye in the room as the circuit judge pronounced them legally mother and daughter. Hope, now officially Hope Margaret Holloway, stood beside her new mother wearing a dress that the town's seamstress had made specially for the occasion, her hair clean and braided with ribbons, looking like a completely different child from the frightened waif who had appeared in the schoolhouse months earlier. But the real celebration had begun weeks before the legal ceremony, in the quiet moments when Hope had first called Margaret Mama without prompting, or when Margaret had tucked her daughter into the small bed she had set up in her cottage, reading bedtime stories and marveling at how perfectly this child fit into her life. It happened in the mornings when Hope would help Margaret prepare breakfast, chattering about her dreams and plans for the day, or in the evenings when they would sit by the fire, Hope working on her lessons while Margaret graded papers, both content in each other's company. Margaret discovered that motherhood was everything she had dreamed it would be and more. Hope was an exceptional child, brilliant and eager to learn, but also loving and generous with a maturity beyond her years. She excelled in her studies, quickly surpassing children much older than herself, but she also showed a natural empathy for other children who were struggling. She became Margaret's assistant in many ways, helping with younger students and translating Margaret's lessons for children whose English was limited. The bond between Margaret and Hope deepened with each passing month. Hope began to talk more about her memories, sharing bits and pieces of her past that helped Margaret understand the trauma she had endured. She had been orphaned when her parents died in a house fire, then taken in by relatives who saw her as an unpaid servant rather than a child to be loved. The abuse had escalated over time until Hope had finally found the courage to run away, wandering for weeks before finding refuge in Margaret's schoolhouse. Margaret listened to these revelations with growing anger at the people who had failed this innocent child, but also with profound gratitude that Hope had somehow found her way to safety. She made sure Hope understood that the abuse had not been her fault, that she was worthy of love and kindness, and that she would never again have to face such cruelty. Slowly, Hope began to believe these truths, blossoming into a confident, joyful child who embraced life with enthusiasm. As Hope grew and thrived, Margaret realized that her own healing had begun as well. The painful wound of infertility had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into something beautiful. She understood now that motherhood was not about biology, but about love, commitment, and choice. She had become a mother in the truest sense, not because she had given birth to Hope, but because she had chosen to love her unconditionally, and Hope had chosen to love her in return. The story of Margaret and Hope became part of Willow Creek folklore, inspiring other families to open their hearts and homes to children in need. Their success encouraged the town to establish more formal systems for caring for orphaned and abandoned children, and Margaret became an advocate for child welfare throughout the territory. She wrote letters to officials and organizations back east, sharing her experiences and arguing for better protection and support for vulnerable children. Years passed, and Hope grew into a remarkable young woman who shared her mother's passion for education and helping others. She became a teacher herself, working alongside Margaret to expand their mission beyond the walls of their schoolhouse. Together, they established a program for taking in children who had nowhere else to go, creating a haven where love and learning could flourish together. When Hope reached adulthood and married a kind man who shared her values, she named her first daughter Margaret, in honor of the woman who had saved her life and taught her the true meaning of love. Margaret became a cherished grandmother, watching with joy as her family grew in ways she had never imagined possible. The cottage that had once felt so empty now overflowed with the laughter and love of multiple generations. The irony was not lost on Margaret that the woman who had been told she could never have children became the mother and grandmother to dozens over the years. Each child who found refuge in their home carried away not just an education and a chance at a better life, but the knowledge that they were worthy of love and capable of great things. Some became teachers themselves, others became doctors, lawyers, merchants, or farmers, but all carried with them the lesson that family is created through love and commitment rather than biology. As Margaret aged, she often reflected on the journey that had brought her to this place of fulfillment and purpose. The pain of her original diagnosis had never completely disappeared, but it had been transformed into something meaningful and beautiful. She understood now that every difficult step of her journey had been necessary, leading her to exactly the place she needed to be when hope needed her most. The woman who had thought herself infertile had learned that fertility had nothing to do with the ability to conceive and everything to do with the capacity to nurture and love. She had given birth to hope not through her body, but through her heart. And that birth had been just as real and meaningful as any biological delivery. In saving hope, she had also saved herself, discovering that sometimes our greatest blessings come disguised as our deepest pain. On quiet evenings, when the schoolhouse was empty and the children were settled in their beds, Margaret would sometimes sit by her window and remember that snowy morning when she had found a frightened little girl hiding in her classroom. She would think about the courage it had taken for Hope to ask if she could be her mama, about the leap of faith they had both taken in choosing to become a family. But mostly she felt gratitude for the whispered question that had changed everything, for the simple words that had given them both exactly what they needed most. Their story echoed through the years, inspiring other women who believed themselves incomplete and other children who felt unwanted. It reminded the community of Willow Creek that families could be formed in many different ways, that love was not limited by biology or convention, and that sometimes the most powerful force on any frontier was the courage to open one's heart to another human being in need. Margaret lived to see Hope become a pillar of the community, a respected educator and advocate who carried forward the lessons of love and acceptance that had defined their relationship. She lived to hold great-grandchildren in her arms and to see the ripple effects of their love spread throughout the territory and beyond. When she passed away peacefully at the age of 79, surrounded by the large and loving family she had created through choice rather than chance, her legacy was secure. The infertile schoolteacher who had thought no one wanted her had discovered that she was exactly what one special child needed. And in finding each other, they had created something beautiful and lasting that would continue to touch lives for generations to come. In the harsh landscape of the American frontier, where survival often seemed to require hardening one's heart, Margaret and Hope had proven that the opposite was true. It was only by opening their hearts completely that they had found the strength not just to survive, but to flourish and help others do the same. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales from the Old West. We'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever experienced an unexpected blessing that changed your life completely, or do you know someone who found their family in an unconventional way? Share your stories with us and let us know what part of Margaret and Hope's journey resonated most with you. Your comments help build our community of storytelling enthusiasts, and we read every single one. Until next time, remember that love has the power to transform any frontier, and sometimes the family we need most finds us when we least expect it.